I moved to the deepest part of the Oregon Cascades to escape the nightmares of Vietnam, convinced that total isolation was the only way to silence the war in my head. But my solitude was shattered when I found a legendary monster caught in a bear trap on my property, screaming in a voice that sounded terrifyingly human. I made a choice that day to save him, never realizing that he would eventually be the one to save me. Before we dive into this story of redemption and survival, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy true stories about the unexplained, please hit that subscribe button. I didn't come to the Cascades to find myself. I came to the mountains to lose myself. In 1971, the world down below was too loud, too angry, and too full of sudden noises that made me dive for cover in the grocery store aisle. I bought 40 acres of timber and rock at the end of a dirt road that didn't even have a name on the county map. It was the only place where the ringing in my ears, a souvenir from the shelling in the humid jungles of '68, finally quieted down to a dull, manageable hum. I built the cabin with my own hands, driving every nail with a kind of desperate rhythm. Physical exhaustion was the only medicine that worked. If I worked until my muscles screamed and my hands bled, I could sometimes sleep for 3 hours without seeing the faces of the boys we left in the mud. I put up a perimeter fence, not to keep animals out, but to keep the world away. I was digging a foxhole, just one made of cedar and stone instead of sandbags, fortifying my position against a society I no longer understood. The silence of the mountains was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the single-pane windows. Down in Portland, people were protesting, spitting on uniforms, or trying desperately to forget the war. Up here, there was only the wind in the Douglas firs and the rushing of the creek. I stopped reading newspapers. I stopped shaving. I let the calendar days bleed into one another until I didn't know if it was Tuesday or Saturday, and I didn't care. I was a ghost haunting my own life. The nights were the enemy. As soon as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the shadows stretched out like grasping hands. I'd sit on the porch with a bottle of cheap whiskey and my grandfather's Winchester, staring into the tree line until my eyes watered. The darkness played tricks on me. A snapping twig wasn't a deer, it was a VC sapper. The wind wasn't air, it was the wash of a medevac chopper. The war hadn't ended for me. It had just changed locations to a colder climate. I knew every inch of my property, patrolling it with a hypervigilance that exhausted me. I knew where the deer bedded down and where the owls nested. I set tripwires, not with explosives, but with tin cans and bells, around the perimeter of the homestead. It was paranoia, pure and simple, but it was the only way I could close my eyes. I was the commander of a one-man outpost, guarding against ghosts that only I could see. I felt safe only when I was completely alone, or so I told myself. I went into town once a month for supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition. I spoke as few words as possible. The shopkeeper looked at me with that mix of pity and fear they saved for shell-shocked vets. I could feel their eyes on my back, judging the twitch in my hand or the way I scanned the exits for threats. I grabbed my goods and retreated, driving the truck back up the mountain like I was outrunning a napalm strike. The further I got from the pavement, the easier it was to breathe. Winter in '72 hit early and hard. The snow piled up 4 feet deep, turning my world into a stark, black-and-white photograph. The isolation deepened as the road became impassable for the truck, sealing me in. Most men would have panicked, but I felt a grim satisfaction. The snow was a buffer. No one could get to me now. I was finally truly unreachable. I spent my days chopping wood and my nights listening to the roof groan under the weight of the ice, finding comfort in the hostility of the elements. But you can't outrun your own head. The isolation that protected me also amplified the memories. Without the distraction of the world, the ghosts got louder. I started talking to myself, just to hear a voice that wasn't screaming commands. I paced the cabin floor, wearing a groove in the wood. I was safe from the enemy, but I was locked in a cage match with my own guilt. I survived the jungle, but I wasn't sure I was going to survive the peace. The forest was indifferent, and I appreciated that. It didn't care about politics or medals or body counts. It just existed. I started tracking animals in the snow, just to have something to focus on other than my shaking hands. I saw elk tracks, coyote trails, the print of a cougar. It was a brutal, honest ecosystem. Eat or be eaten, freeze or survive. It made sense to me in a way human society never did anymore. It was honest violence, not the senseless kind I had seen overseas. One morning in late January, the silence broke. It wasn't a gunshot or a scream, but a sound of distress that didn't belong in the natural rhythm of the woods. I was out checking the fence line on snowshoes, my breath pluming in the frigid air, when I heard it. A thrashing, a high-pitched keen that sounded terrifyingly like a wounded child. My stomach dropped. I racked around into the Winchester and moved toward the sound, expecting to find a poacher or a lost hiker, never imagining that the war was about to find me in the last place I looked. The sound led me down into a ravine on the northern edge of my property, a place where the shadows stayed long even at high noon. The snow here was disturbed, churned up into a violent mess of white powder and dark earth. As I crested the ridge, the smell hit me before the sight did. The metallic copper tang of fresh blood, sharp against the clean winter air. It was a scent that instantly made my hands sweat inside my gloves. I raised the rifle, scanning for a cougar or a bear. But what I found at the bottom of the slope defied every field manual I had ever read. Caught in the rusty jaws of a massive illegal bear trap, the kind with teeth like jagged daggers, was a creature that shouldn't have existed. It was lying on its side, thrashing weakly in the blood-stained snow. It was covered in thick, dark hair, matted with ice and gore. It wasn't a bear. The limbs were too long, the anatomy too human. It looked like a teenager in a ghillie suit, maybe 6 feet tall, but the sheer density of the muscle beneath the fur told me this was something else entirely. It saw me and froze, its chest heaving, eyes wide with a terror that was devastatingly intelligent. It tried to drag itself backward, pulling the trapped leg taut. The metal teeth bit deeper into its ankle, and the creature let out a scream that shattered my reality. It wasn't a growl. It was a high-pitched, garbled cry of agony that sounded exactly like a human boy calling for his mother. The sound drilled straight into my ear canal and detonated a landmine in my brain. The snow around me dissolved. The gray Oregon sky turned into the humid green canopy of the Mekong Delta. I wasn't looking at a monster. I was looking at Private Miller, 18 years old, stepping on a bouncing Betty. I dropped to my knees in the snow, gasping for air, the rifle slipping from my grip. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Medic!" I tried to shout, but the word died in my throat. I was hyperventilating, the cold air burning my lungs, my vision tunneling. I squeezed my eyes shut, clawing at the snow, trying to ground myself in the freezing temperature. "It's 1972, I chanted in my head. "You are in Oregon. There is no Charlie here." It took everything I had to force the flashback back into its box, locking the lid with trembling mental fingers. When I opened my eyes, the hallucination had faded, but the horror remained. The creature was still there, watching me. It had stopped thrashing, sensing my distress, or perhaps just exhausted by its own pain. It was making a low whimpering sound now, clutching the dirt with hand-like paws. I looked at the trap. It was an old, cruel thing, likely set by poachers months ago and forgotten. The creature's leg was mangled, the bone likely cracked. If I left it here, the coyotes would tear it apart before sunset. I stood up, my legs shaking. Logic told me to walk away. Logic told me to shoot it and put it out of its misery. This was an apex predator, a legend, a monster. But the eyes stopped me. They were dark brown, filled with tears, and wide with the same helpless fear I had seen in the eyes of dying men. I couldn't leave it. I had left too many good men behind in the mud. I couldn't walk away from something that was suffering, not when I had the power to stop it. I slung the rifle over my shoulder and took a step forward, hands raised. "Easy," I croaked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The creature hissed, baring teeth that were flat and human-like, but it didn't lunge. It was too weak. I moved slowly, projecting a calm I didn't feel. I knelt beside the trap, the smell of musk and blood overwhelming me. Up close, the creature was both terrifying and beautiful, a perfect organism of the woods. I reached for the springs of the trap. They were heavy, industrial tension steel. I needed leverage. I used the butt of my rifle as a pry bar, wedging it into the mechanism. "This is gonna hurt," I muttered, gritting my teeth. I put my weight into it, straining until the veins in my neck bulged. The metal groaned, the rusty springs fighting me every inch of the way. The creature tensed, letting out a sharp yelp as the pressure shifted, but it didn't bite me. It watched my face, confusing my effort for an attack, until the jaws suddenly snapped open with a loud clang. The leg came free, a mess of matted fur and torn flesh. Bigfoot tried to scramble away but collapsed immediately, the injured limb useless. It looked up at me, waiting for the killing blow. Instead, I moved closer. "I can't carry you," I said, "but you can't stay here." I grabbed its arm, thick as a tree branch, and pulled it over my shoulder. It was heavy, a dense, dead weight, but it understood. It wrapped a long, hairy arm around my neck, leaning its weight on me. We stumbled through the snow like two drunks leaving a bar, a Vietnam vet and a Bigfoot, leaving a trail of blood back to the cabin. I didn't take it to the house. That felt too intimate, too dangerous. I kicked open the door to the barn, a drafty structure I used for storage, and guided it to a pile of dry hay in the corner. It collapsed onto the straw, eyes rolling back in its head as the shock finally took over. I stood over it, my hands covered in its blood, my breath coming in ragged gasps, realizing with a dawn of terror that I had just invited the unknown into my sanctuary. I backed away to the barn door, sliding the heavy wooden latch home, not to keep things out, but to create a barrier against the world for both of us. The creature huddled in the far corner of the stall, pressing itself so hard against the rough-hewn oak that I thought the boards might snap. Every time I shifted my weight or the old timber settled with a groan, it flinched violently, pulling its knees to its chest and covering its head with those massive, trembling hands. It wasn't the defensive posture of a cornered predator ready to fight. It was the terrified recoil of something that had been beaten until it expected nothing but pain. I fetched my field trauma kit from the tack room, the canvas bag smelling of antiseptic and old memories. When I knelt down and unzipped it, the metallic zip sound made Bigfoot let out a sharp, involuntary shriek that cut through me. It scrambled backward, kicking out with its good leg, its eyes wide and rolling white with panic. It was staring at the metal instruments, the scissors, the forceps, the scalpel, like they were torture devices. It knew what metal meant. It knew that man-made things were cold, hard, and designed to tear flesh. I froze, my hands held up in surrender, and looked at it, really looked at it. I had seen that specific caliber of fear before. I had seen it in the eyes of a new recruit named Baker in the moments after a mortar attack, when a car backfiring 3 streets away in Saigon would send him diving into the dirt, weeping and clawing at the asphalt. It was the look of a nervous system that had been rewired by violence. Bigfoot wasn't just hurt physically, it was psychologically shattered. It was waiting for the next blow, the next explosion, the next betrayal. The bear trap hadn't been an isolated incident. You don't get that terrified of a human shape unless you've watched what humans do when they think no one is looking. I looked at the old scars on its flank, jagged hairless lines that weren't from brambles or cougar claws. They were graze marks from bullets. Someone had hunted this thing. Someone had probably hunted its family. It was an orphan of a war I didn't know was being fought in these mountains, a survivor of a massacre that left it afraid of its own shadow. A bitter iron taste filled my mouth as the realization hit me. I sat back on my heels, abandoning the medical kit for a moment. I looked at this trembling giant and felt a crack form in the wall I had built around myself. I was looking in a mirror. I was the guy who slept with a gun under his pillow and checked the perimeter 3 times a night. I was the guy who couldn't handle fireworks or sudden shouts. I was the monster in the woods who hid from the world because the world hurt too much. We were 2 broken soldiers from different armies, stranded in the same foxhole. I put the metal tools away, realizing they were doing more harm than good. I needed to de-escalate the situation before I could treat the wound. I sat on the straw about 10 feet away, crossing my legs and making myself smaller, less imposing. I took a deep breath and let my shoulders drop, consciously releasing the tension I carried like armor. "I know," I whispered, the words barely audible in the drafty barn. "I know it never stops ringing in your ears. I know you think I'm going to hurt you because that's what we do, but I'm done hurting things." The creature watched me, its chest heaving with exertion. It waited for the trick. It waited for the weapon to appear, but I just sat there, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light coming through the cracks in the wall, refusing to make aggressive eye contact. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, its breathing hitched and leveled out. It lowered its hands from its head, peering at me over its knuckles with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. It saw that I wasn't advancing. It saw that I wasn't holding the metal teeth that had bitten its leg. It was the first ceasefire it had probably ever known. I moved again, but this time I moved like I was underwater. Slow, fluid, telegraphing every inch. I dipped a clean rag into a bucket of warm water I had brought from the wood stove. No shiny tools, just cloth and water. I crept forward on my knees, humming a low, tuneless melody, something my mother used to hum when I was sick, a sound from a life before the war. The creature tensed, its muscles bunching like steel cables under the fur, but it didn't kick. It let me reach out. It let me touch the hot, swollen flesh of its ankle. As I cleaned the wound, washing away the dried blood and grease from the trap, the creature let out a low, vibrating whimper. It was in agony, but it didn't strike me. It gripped a handful of straw in its fist, squeezing it until the dry stalks pulverized into dust. It was restraining itself. It understood on some primal level that this pain was different. It was the pain of knitting bones, not breaking them. It looked down at the top of my head as I worked, its hot breath ruffling my hair, studying the hands that were trying to fix what my kind had destroyed. Night fell hard, turning the barn into a cavern of shadows that usually brought my demons out to play. But I didn't go back to the cabin. I couldn't leave it alone in the dark. I knew what the dark did to a mind that couldn't forget. I pulled a horse blanket around my shoulders and sat against the wall, the Winchester lying uselessly in the straw far out of reach. The creature lay on its side, watching me, its eyes reflecting the moonlight. We didn't sleep. We kept watch together, 2 traumatized sentries guarding against the nightmares. waiting for a dawn that promised safety, or at least a little less pain. The barn became a confessional, a sanctuary where the laws of man and nature were suspended in favor of something older. For 2 weeks, my life narrowed down to the rhythm of changing bandages and hauling buckets of water. The creature's recovery was slow. The infection from the rusted iron had dug deep, fighting the antibiotics I crushed into its food. At first, the silence between us was filled with tension, the air thick with the memory of the trap. But as the fever broke and the swelling went down, the silence changed. It became a vacuum that needed to be filled, and for the first time in years, I found myself wanting to fill it with words. I started talking to it at night, sitting on an overturned milk crate while the winter wind rattled the siding. At first, it was just nonsense, commentary on the weather, the quality of the hay, the price of feed. But the creature listened with such intense, unblinking focus that the surface-level chatter felt insufficient. It didn't judge. It didn't offer platitudes or pills. It just watched me with those amber eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 years of patience. And so, the dam broke. I started telling it the things I couldn't tell the VA shrink, the things I couldn't even whisper to the priest back home. I told it about the humidity that stuck to your skin like napalm. I told it about the smell of burning diesel and rot that never washed out of my uniform. I told it about the ambush in the Ashau Valley, about the way the sky lit up and the ground turned into a meat grinder. I wept openly in front of this beast, tears carving tracks through the grime on my face, confessing the survivor's guilt that had been eating a hole in my gut since 1968. I told it I was sorry I lived when better men didn't. I told it I was afraid I was broken beyond repair. The creature didn't recoil from my grief. In the wild, weakness gets you killed. But here, it seemed to understand that this purging was necessary. When my voice cracked and I started to shake, caught in the grip of a memory that felt too real, the creature would make a low, rumbling sound in its chest. It was a purr, a vibration so deep I could feel it in the floorboards. It was a grounding frequency, a biological lullaby that cut through the panic and anchored me back in the present. It was telling me, in its own language, that the danger was past. Trust is a physical thing, built brick by brick. The first time I offered it an apple directly from my hand, I thought it might take my fingers off. It sniffed the fruit, its wet nose brushing my palm, and then took it with a gentleness that defied its size. That small act of acceptance broke the last barrier. I wasn't the enemy anymore. I was the provider. And it wasn't the monster, it was the guest. We were sharing bread, the oldest treaty in human history, forged in a drafty barn in the middle of nowhere. I realized that I was healing too. The nightmares that usually woke me screaming, drenched in sweat, began to recede. I wasn't patrolling the perimeter 3 times a night anymore. I was sleeping in the barn loft, listening to the creature's rhythmic breathing below, and for the first time, I felt safe. I wasn't guarding the fort alone. There was another sentry, one with ears that could hear a mouse sneeze at 50 yards and strength enough to tear a door off its hinges. The solitude that had been my prison was turning into a partnership. I taught it that hands could be used for kindness, not just violence. I showed it how to brush the tangles out of its fur, using an old horse brush. At first, it flinched at the bristles, expecting pain, but soon it leaned into the strokes, closing its eyes in ecstasy. It was learning that touch didn't always mean a trap or a blow. It was relearning how to be a living thing that deserved care, shedding the trauma of the hunter's bullet just as it shed its winter coat. In return, it taught me that not everything in the woods wanted to kill me. It showed me a level of stillness I had never achieved. It could sit for hours without moving a muscle, just watching the dust motes dance, completely at peace with the passage of time. It didn't worry about the past or the future. It existed entirely in the now. Watching it, I learned to slow my own racing heart. I learned to sit still without reaching for my rifle. It was teaching me mindfulness better than any meditation tape ever could. We became a strange pair, the vet and the cryptid, moving around each other with a choreographed familiarity. I would change its bandage, and it would groom the back of my hand with a rough, affectionate lick. We communicated in grunts, gestures, and looks, a pigeon language of survival. I had saved its life, yes, but as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots of spring appeared, I knew the truth was more complicated. By giving me something to protect, something to care for, it was saving mine. But as its strength returned, so did its instincts. It started testing the leg, putting weight on it, pacing the length of the stall. It was restless, checking the wind that blew through the cracks in the door. I knew it wouldn't stay in the barn forever. It was a creature of the open forest, and the walls were starting to feel like a cage. But as it paced, I noticed something new. It wasn't just looking for an exit. It was positioning itself between me and the door. It was starting to guard me. By late February, the limp was gone, replaced by a fluid, powerful stride that ate up the ground. I expected him to leave the moment the barn door was unlatched, to bolt for the tree line and never look back. But he didn't. Instead, he became my shadow. Wherever I went on the homestead, he was 2 steps behind me, moving with a silent grace that unnerved me at first. If I was chopping wood, he sat on a stump nearby, watching the forest for threats. If I was fixing the fence, he paced the perimeter, his nose testing the wind. He wasn't a prisoner anymore. He had self-deployed as my personal security detail. The dynamic of the nights shifted completely. I moved back into the cabin, but I left the door unlatched, a violation of every safety protocol I had established for myself. He didn't come inside to sleep. The heat of the wood stove was too much for his thick winter coat. Instead, he curled up on the porch right in front of the door, a 600-pound biological barricade. I slept better knowing he was there than I ever had with a loaded gun under my pillow. I knew that nothing, not a bear, not a drifter, not a ghost, could get through that door without going through him first. But the real protection wasn't physical, it was psychological. The nightmares were stubborn things, retreating during the day, but launching guerrilla attacks when my guard was down. One night the war came back with a vengeance. I was back in the rice paddy, the air screaming with mortars, the mud sucking me down. I woke up thrashing, shouting orders to dead men, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. I was drowning in panic, disoriented and terrifyingly alone in the dark. Then, the door creaked open. A massive shadow filled the room, blocking out the moonlight. In my delirium, I reached for the weapon that wasn't there, thinking the VC had breached the wire. But the shadow didn't attack. It moved with a swift, heavy certainty to the side of the bed. I felt the mattress dip under an immense weight, and then a hand, heavy, warm, and smelling of pine resin, pressed flat against my heaving chest. It wasn't a restraint, it was an anchor. The weight of his hand pinned me to the mattress, not painfully, but with enough force to stop my thrashing. He leaned over me, his face inches from mine, and let out that low, vibrating rumble again. It resonated through my sternum, shaking the panic loose from my ribs. He looked deep into my eyes, his expression calm and utterly present. He was pulling me out of the flashback, forcing me to focus on the here and now, on the weight of his hand and the sound of his breath. "You are not there," he was saying. "You are here. I am here." I lay there for an hour, my hand gripping his thick, furry wrist like a lifeline. He didn't move. He sat patiently, absorbing my terror, lending me his calm. Slowly, my heart rate synced with his slower, deeper rhythm. The adrenaline faded, leaving me exhausted but lucid. I realized then that he understood trauma better than any doctor. He knew that sometimes you can't talk yourself down. Sometimes you need a physical tether to keep you from floating away into the abyss. He was my service animal, my medic, my brother in arms. This new dynamic gave me something I hadn't had since the day I received my discharge papers. A mission. For 3 years, my only goal had been to survive the day. Now I had a purpose. I had to be strong enough to care for him. I had to get up in the morning to check his leg. I had to eat, so I had the energy to hunt for both of us. The crushing weight of my own existence became lighter because I was carrying it for someone else. I wasn't just a broken vet waiting to die. I was a guardian. We fell into a routine that felt like a quiet, domestic peace. I talked to him constantly, narrating my chores, explaining the world to him. "This is a hammer," I'd say, showing him the tool. "We use it to build." He would watch, head tilted, absorbing the information. He started trying to help, clumsy at first, mimicking my motions. He would carry logs that would have taken me 3 trips to move, stacking them with surprising neatness. We were a 2-man unit, operating with a synchronized efficiency that made the hard labor of the homestead feel effortless. I stopped looking at the tree line with fear. The woods weren't full of enemies anymore. They were full of life. I watched him interact with the world, seeing the wonder in his eyes as he examined a pine cone or watched a hawk circle overhead. He was reintroducing me to the beauty I had forgotten how to see. Through his eyes, the forest wasn't a battlefield. It was a home. He was healing the land for me, washing away the blood I had superimposed over the landscape. But as the weeks passed and his strength returned fully, I noticed a change in his focus. He stopped watching me quite so closely and started watching the brush. His ears would swivel toward the sound of a squirrel or a rabbit. He would stand perfectly still, vibrating with a different kind of energy. Predatory, focused, lethal. He wasn't just my protector anymore. He was remembering that he was a hunter. And one morning, instead of waiting for me to bring the food, he disappeared into the mist, moving with a silent, deadly intent that told me our dynamic was about to shift again. One morning in late March, I woke up to an empty porch. The heavy imprint in the sleeping bag I had laid out for him was cold. Panic, sharp and familiar, spiked in my chest. I grabbed my boots and rifle, convinced he had wandered off and gotten hurt, or worse, that the infection had returned and he had crawled away to die. I spent 3 hours combing the woods, shouting his name, or at least the whistle I used to call him, my voice echoing uselessly off the evergreens. The silence of the forest, usually my friend, felt heavy and accusing. I had failed my watch. I was trudging back to the cabin, defeat heavy on my shoulders, when I saw him. He was sitting on the porch steps, calm as you please, grooming the burrs out of his fur. Sitting at his feet, neatly displayed like a trophy, was a large snowshoe hare. It wasn't roadkill. The neck was snapped cleanly, the work of a predator that knew exactly how to kill efficiently. He looked up at me, his eyes bright and proud, and nudged the rabbit toward me with his foot. It wasn't a request for food. It was a contribution to the mess hall. I stared at the offering, feeling a complicated knot of pride and sadness tighten in my throat. He wasn't the invalid anymore. He wasn't the helpless victim I had pulled out of the trap. He was an apex predator who had remembered how to hunt. I knelt down and picked up the rabbit, nodding to him. "Good work, soldier," I whispered. He let out a satisfied huff and watched me dress the meat. That night, he didn't wait for me to cook his portion. He took the raw offcuts and ate them with a primal relish that reminded me, starkly, that he was a wild animal, not a house guest. This marked the turning point. The dynamic of dependency was over. He began to spend more time in the tree line than on the porch, disappearing for hours at a time to patrol his old territories. I watched him move through the brush, silent as smoke, his limp completely gone. He was reclaiming his independence, testing the boundaries of his freedom. I knew the day was coming when he wouldn't come back, when the call of his own kind, if any were left, would be louder than the safety of my cabin. I realized I had a new responsibility. I hadn't just healed him, I had habituated him. He had learned that humans, specifically me, were safe. But out there, beyond my fence line, humans were the deadliest thing in the woods. If he walked up to a hunter or a logger the way he walked up to me, he'd be dead before he hit the ground. I had to untrain him. I had to teach him the rules of engagement for a war he didn't know he was fighting. I had to teach him that I was the exception, not the rule. I started basic training the next day. I walked him out to my old Ford pickup truck parked in the driveway. He had always been curious about it, sniffing the tires and the exhaust pipe. I made him stand back, then I climbed in and cranked the engine. The sudden roar of the V8 and the cloud of blue smoke made him jump, but he didn't run. He looked at me through the windshield, confused. I revved the engine, honked the horn, and yelled at him to go, get back, making myself look aggressive and loud. He looked hurt at first, confused by my sudden hostility, but I kept at it. I drove the truck down the driveway and back, honking and shouting every time he stayed in the open. It broke my heart to see him flinch from me, but I needed him to associate the sound of an engine with immediate danger. I needed him to know that metal beasts meant hide, not investigate. We spent days drilling this. Engine noise equals cover. Taking cover equals safety. He was a quick study. Within a week, the moment I touched the door handle of the truck, he would vanish into the rhododendrons. I would drive down the logging road, scanning the woods, and I couldn't see a hair of him. He learned to flatten himself against the earth, to use the contours of the land to break his silhouette. He was applying the lessons of evasion perfectly. I had turned him into a ghost, invisible to anyone who passed by on 4 wheels. It was a grim success. I had taught him to fear the world that created him. I also taught him the difference between my scent and others. I brought back old clothes from the Goodwill in town, shirts that smelled of strangers, of detergent and cigarettes and cheap cologne. I laid them out and made a show of recoiling from them, signaling bad and danger. I let him sniff them, watching his nose wrinkle, and then rewarded him when he backed away. He began to understand that the scent of man was a threat indicator, a tripwire that should send him running in the opposite direction. By mid-April, the snow was gone from the lower elevations, and the mud on the logging roads was drying out. The world was opening up again, which meant the isolation was ending. I was splitting wood one afternoon, the creature dozing in a patch of sun near the tree line, when the wind shifted. It brought a sound that made my blood run cold, not the familiar rattle of my Ford, but the deep, throaty growl of a heavy-duty engine and the crunch of gravel under aggressive tires. It was coming up my driveway. The outside world had arrived, and it was bringing trouble. The truck that rumbled into my clearing wasn't a local rig. It was a brand new Chevy with a lift kit and a custom rack of off-road lights, the kind of vehicle bought by men who like to play soldier on the weekends. I stood on the porch, my Winchester resting in the crook of my arm, watching 2 men step out. They were dressed in expensive camouflage, carrying high-caliber hunting rifles with scopes big enough to see the moon. They didn't look like locals looking for firewood. They looked like a search and destroy team. The air instantly smelled of danger, a mix of exhaust fumes and aggressive entitlement. I didn't wave. I just racked the slide of my rifle. Clack, clack. A sound that carries a hell of a lot of weight in a quiet forest. "Turn it around," I called out, my voice flat and hard. "Private property." The driver, a big man with a thick beard and a confident swagger, laughed it off. "Just passing through, partner," he shouted back, walking toward me like he owned the place. "Tracking a rogue bear. Big one. Left a blood trail a few months back. We heard it might be denning up this way." My stomach tightened. They weren't tracking a bear. They had heard the rumors, the barroom whispers about the monster in the high woods. They were trophy hunters, looking for a story to tell and a head to mount on a wall. I stepped off the porch, placing myself between them and the tree line, where I knew the creature was hiding. "No bears here," I said, keeping my finger outside the trigger guard, but ready. "Just me. And I don't like visitors. Get back in the truck." The second man, younger and twitchy, raised his binoculars, scanning the woods behind the barn. "I see tracks, Jim," he muttered. "Big ones. Mud's fresh." He unslung his rifle, clicking the safety off. The gesture sent a jolt of electricity through my nervous system. I was back in the jungle, watching a patrol move into a village. I knew what came next. The shooting, the confusion, the collateral damage. The creature was out there, likely watching, and if he moved, if he panicked, these men would cut him down without blinking. "I said get out," I barked, raising the barrel of my Winchester an inch. The big man stopped smiling. "Now look here, old-timer," he said, his hand drifting toward his own weapon. "We got a right to pursue dangerous game. If you're harboring a nuisance animal, that's a federal offense. Why don't you put that pea shooter down before you get hurt?" The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They saw a crazy hermit in a flannel shirt. They didn't see the sergeant who had held a hill in the Ashau Valley for 3 days with nothing but grit and a jammed M16. Time seemed to slow down. I looked at the younger man, scanning the brush. I saw the movement before he did, a shadow shifting deep in the cedars. The creature was there. He hadn't run. He was waiting, maybe even preparing to defend me. If the kid saw him, he'd fire. If he fired, the creature would charge, and then I'd have to kill 2 men to save 1 beast. The math was brutal, and the outcome was prison or death. But looking at these men, with their lust for violence and their lack of respect, something inside me snapped. Or maybe finally, it healed. I made the choice I couldn't make in '68. I wasn't going to stand by while the innocent were slaughtered. I stepped fully into their line of sight, blocking the view of the woods, and raised my rifle to my shoulder, aiming directly at the driver's chest. "It's not a bear," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "And if you raise that rifle 1 inch higher, you're not going to leave this mountain." It wasn't a bluff. The tremor in my hands was gone. I was stone cold steady. The driver froze, looking into my eyes. He was looking for fear, for hesitation. What he found was the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had walked through hell and brought some of the fire back with him. He saw the void. He saw that I was perfectly willing to die right there on my own lawn, and more importantly, that I was willing to take him with me. The bravado drained out of him like water from a cracked cup. He realized he wasn't dealing with a poacher. He was dealing with a soldier holding a defensive line. "Crazy bastard," he muttered, slowly taking his hand off his rifle. "It ain't worth it, kid. Let's go." He spat on the ground, a final act of defiance, and backed away toward the truck, keeping his eyes on my barrel. The younger man looked disappointed, but followed his lead. They climbed back into the cab, slamming the doors. The engine roared to life, and they reversed aggressively, tires spinning gravel as they tore back down the driveway. I stood there, weapon shouldered, until the sound of the engine faded into silence. My knees finally gave out, and I sat down heavily on the porch steps, the adrenaline crash leaving me shaking. I had pointed a loaded weapon at another human being. I had almost crossed a line I could never uncross. But as I sat there, gasping for air, a massive shape detached itself from the shadows of the barn. The creature walked into the sunlight, moving silently to the foot of the stairs. He looked at the tire tracks, then up at me. He knew. He understood exactly what had just happened. I hadn't just saved his life. I had chosen his side against my own kind. The confrontation with the hunters broke the stalemate. I knew, and he knew, that my land wasn't the sanctuary we pretended it was. Men like that would talk. They would come back with dogs, with friends, with more firepower. The bubble was popped. The creature stayed for 3 more days, restless and agitated, pacing the fence line and chuffing at the wind. He sensed the shifting pressure in the air. The season had turned, the snow was gone, and the high country was opening up. It was time for migration. It was time for him to go back to the deep wilderness where trucks couldn't follow. The departure wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no hugs. I was drinking coffee on the porch as the sun came up, and he walked out of the barn carrying a deer leg he had saved. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, where the domestic grass met the wild fern, and looked back. He held my gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable but profound, a mixture of gratitude and wild indifference. Then he turned and melted into the timber. 1 second he was there, a dark monolith against the green. The next, he was just a shadow among shadows. The silence rushed back in to fill the space he left, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty. I expected him to vanish forever, to become just another ghost story, I told myself. But a month later, I found the first message. Sitting on the porch railing, exactly where I used to leave his apples, was a river stone. It was perfectly round, smooth as glass, and dark black, a geological anomaly in a valley of gray granite. He had found it, carried it for miles, and left it for me. It was a receipt, a signal. I am out here. I remember. I kept that stone in my pocket like a talisman, rubbing my thumb over it whenever the anxiety started to creep back in. The gifts became a seasonal ritual. In the summer, I'd find a bundle of turkey feathers tied together with intricate knots of dried grass, dexterity that proved his intelligence was far beyond what science admitted. In the fall, it was a piece of cedar driftwood, carved with crude but deliberate markings that looked like a map of the valley. We were pen pals writing in the language of the earth. He was telling me about his travels, about the things he saw, and I would leave out bags of salt or jars of honey in return. We were connected by an invisible thread that stretched across the mountains, a bond that distance couldn't snap. But the biggest change wasn't in the woods. It was in me. The paranoia that had turned my home into a bunker began to crumble. I took down the tripwires. I stopped patrolling the perimeter at 2 a.m. I realized that if I could earn the trust of a wild, terrified giant, surely I could navigate a conversation with a shopkeeper. I started driving into town not just for supplies, but to be around people. I stopped looking at the ground. I looked men in the eye, and I didn't see enemies anymore. I saw people who were just trying to get by, just like I was. I found a group meeting at the VFW hall in the city, a circle of folding chairs filled with men who flinched at loud noises. For the first time, I sat down and didn't just listen. I spoke. I didn't tell them about the Bigfoot. They would have locked me up. But I told them about the bear trap. I told them about the fear of the metal teeth, about the infection that festers if you don't clean the wound, about the patience it takes to let something heal. I told them that even the wildest, most broken things can come back from the brink if they have someone to watch their six. I became a regular. I wasn't the crazy hermit of the Cascades anymore. I was Jack, the guy who listened. I used the patience the creature had taught me, the ability to sit in silence and just be with someone's pain without trying to fix it immediately. I realized that trauma is just a bear trap on the soul. You can't pry it open alone. The springs are too strong. You need leverage. You need a brother to put his weight on the bar so you can pull your leg free. I was paying forward the debt I owed to the creature. He had saved my humanity, so I used it to help save others. Years rolled by. My hair turned gray, and the hike up the ridge got harder. The gifts on the porch became less frequent, once a year, then every 2 years. I knew he was moving further away, perhaps pushed deeper into the remote wilderness by the encroaching logging roads, or maybe he had found a mate and had his own family to protect. But he never completely forgot. Every now and then, I'd wake up to find a single, perfect pine cone or a shed antler waiting for me, a reminder that the pack still held. The last time I saw him was in the autumn of 1985. I was sitting on the porch, my joints aching in the damp air, when he stepped out of the twilight. He was massive now, silver-backed with age, scarred and magnificent. He didn't come close. He stood at the tree line, a king surveying his old territory. I stood up, leaning on my cane, and reached into my shirt. I pulled out my dog tags, the metal identity discs that had defined my war and my trauma. I walked halfway across the yard and hung them on a low branch of a cedar tree. I stepped back, and he moved forward. He sniffed the tags, the metal chiming softly against each other. He looked at me one last time, and I raised my hand in a salute. Not a military one, but a gesture of equal respect. You are free, I thought. And so am I. He took the tags in his massive hand, not crushing them, just holding the metal that used to signify death. And then he turned. He walked back into the darkness, taking my war with him, leaving me standing in the light of my own home, finally, truly at peace.